Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming today. My name is Tim Kane. I'm a senior economist at CEDA, and I'll be facilitating today's discussion. Before I go too much further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we collectively are meeting. Where I am, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect, of course, to any First Nations people participating here today. Uh, I would like to thank NAB as the sponsor for this seminar and, in fact, this series. And as most of you would know, we've got a really, really interesting discussion today. You'd be aware that international students has become somewhat of a thorny political issue. And with the federal election around the corner, the major parties have demonstrated that they have different stances on how Australia should manage the intake of international students. Following the rapid increase in student migration numbers post-COVID, the federal government introduced Ministerial Direction 107 in December 2023 as a means to try and prioritise and manage some of those visa applications, and that was on the back of the highest international student commencements in our history. Subsequently, the government introduced a bill Parliament in 2024 to cap international student numbers, only to have it blocked in the Senate by the Coalition and the Greens late last year. So following on from that, the government announced a new measure, Ministerial Direction 111, in December to manage those student numbers. With this context in mind, I'm really excited to be joined by three fantastic speakers who have a wealth of knowledge in this area and are sure to bring some different perspectives to the debate. So the speakers are Simon Banks, who is the Managing Director at Hawker Britton, Nico Louw, who is the Policy Director and Chief Economist at the Menzies Research Centre, and Sally Nimon, who is the Director of Policy at the Group of Eight. So welcome to the three of you. In a moment, I'll ask each of the speakers to give some brief opening remarks, and then we can start taking questions from all of you. We do this through Pigeonhole, so that's where you can pose a question or vote for an existing question that's there. And I think the details should be coming up on the screen. If you can, please just vote for the ones that you really like. I will endeavour to sort of ask what are coming out as the sort of most popular questions. I believe that the passcode there is up, but it's student for anybody who potentially can't see that. So I think without further ado, why don't I hand over to you, Simon, to kick us off with some opening remarks.
Thanks, Tim. And look, I think you gave probably a good little background to why we're talking about this issue in the first place. There's no doubt, obviously, during COVID, the higher education sector basically got almost no support out of the then federal government. As Australia reopened and resumed, unlike a lot of other sectors, it really had to turn to the international education sector for support to kind of revamp itself and get itself up and running. And so I think the response of a lot of providers, which is to essentially go gangbusters to try and get as many students in the door as they could, was probably not an unsurprising one. But the truth, of course, is in the Australian context, and we know one of the big issues that will be fought out between all of the parties, I think, in the upcoming federal election is around housing policy and access to housing and those sorts of things. That when you bring a lot of extra people into Australia and you apply pressure to the housing market, that has a knock-on effect for a whole range of other Australians. And so the government, the current Labor government, for a couple of reasons. One, in order to ensure that there was perhaps a more managed growth to the sector off the back of COVID, partly to try and make sure that there was, I guess, some integrity and proper process around exactly which students were coming in and how they were being managed, but particularly because of those sort of housing pressures and I guess the social license that the sector needs to be able to continue to operate as a very successful export sector, decided it was going to bring caps in. Now, I know a lot of people in the sector think those are a pretty blunt instrument to try and achieve the objective that the government has sought to achieve, and I don't think the government would deny deny that that's true too. But they're the fundamental reasons why the government's gone and done what it has done. As Tim noted, the government introduced what was called the ESOS Amendment Bill to try and manage that process. And it didn't just cover the issue around student caps, it also covered a range of sort of integrity measures around the operations of the sector. And it was obviously looking for the Parliament to pass that last year. For my sins, I must say I started out as a lawyer many, many years ago. And in the mid-1990s, one of the first big areas I worked on was considerable problems about integrity within the international student market and its interaction with the migration system. And the truth is, over the 20-something years since, we've seen the occasional outbursts around this of sometimes providers coming into the sector who, let's face it, aren't as good as they should be, have sought to exploit the rules to make money rather than provide integrity within the system. So I think the government was very mindful of some of that historic experience in trying to introduce what I accept was a very kind of blunt measure. Alongside that, as Tim said, the government initially introduced Ministerial Direction 107. And if you actually look at, again, the intent that the government set around that, it was to try and focus these caps more around those programs which it knew or believed had a higher degree of integrity around them and tried to prioritise those. The truth is, and I think, the government received this feedback very directly from parts of the sector and certainly during the Senate inquiry into the bill, is that there were various parts of the sector, particularly some universities maybe with a more kind of vocational focus to their higher education degrees, but particularly a number in the regions, that the approach the government was taking was unfair to them and was depriving them of an opportunity to get their fair share of the student population as it came back into Australia. The government did accept that advice, and obviously Ministerial Direction 111 is the consequence of all of that. Still a very blunt instrument trying to manage those caps, but essentially what they've tried to do is accepting that if you're an accredited university provider for international student education, that you do need to meet basic minimum requirements around those sorts of integrity measures. It's essentially said that up to 80% of your quota, you'll be given priority for the assessment of those applications. And that's designed obviously to try and spread that student population around all of those higher education institutions as best as possible. But of course, the final 20% will be given lower priority in the order of processing. Now, I don't think there's any doubt that some of the perhaps larger universities, some of the G8 in particular universities that have a very kind of strong and traditional pipeline with overseas providers, we'll see that as disadvantaging them relative to some of these other universities. But the purpose of that ministerial directive was really just to be able to manage a scarce resource, the ability of public servants to be able to process these visas and to spread it around the sector a little bit more generally. And of course, a lot of those vocational and regional universities are located in places where, of course, there are still housing pressures, but they're probably not quite as great as, of course, they are in some of our inner city locations where the bigger universities tend to be located. So that's the purpose of it. I think the government would have much preferred to obviously have had the ESOS Amendment Bill passed by the Parliament. I think the truth is at the coming federal election, there will be caps on the international student education sector, no matter who wins the election. We still don't know the form in which the coalition's policy will take around those. And I think that's one of the great uncertainties at the sector at the moment. So I think it would benefit the sector greatly if the coalition were at least able to tell people what their intentions were around this. And of course, with an election due sometime between now and the middle of May, hopefully the sector will get that answer pretty quickly. And then more importantly, 16 million Australians will get to decide who forms the next government.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Simon. Nico, if I could pass to you for some opening comments, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Simon. I think Simon's laid out well why we're having this discussion now. Post-COVID, there was this surge of international students. It's why it's become a political issue. And as Simon says, it's essentially a bipartisan policy now to put a cap on international students. We're really just waiting to have the debate about what form that cap takes in terms of its mechanism and its number. And we put out a report last year off the back of this discussion, and essentially the crux of that is that we think that we're missing part of the debate here. The debate's very heavily focused on immigration numbers at the moment, and we think what's missing from that debate is a discussion about educational quality. And essentially what we're putting forward is that we think a cap's needed because universities, particularly the big universities and the group of 8 in the cities, have become too focused on international students, and they're neglecting what, in our view, should be their core mission of educating domestic students to a higher quality. Australia already has by far the highest proportion of international students in the tertiary sector in the world, sitting at about 28% on the pre-COVID data. And the next after that's New Zealand at about 20%, and then you get well below 20% for everyone else. So we think that a cap is a good policy. We think the way the government's gone about it is probably needlessly complicated for both the bureaucracy and government and universities, setting individual caps that are calculated in a way that frankly, from a public perspective, is very difficult to understand what a new overseas commencement is versus actual numbers of students. And our view is that a simpler method to address both what we think are issues with the educational impact of international students and the immigration and housing issues that are being discussed at a political level is to have a cap that's set as a proportion of commencements each year. We think that should be around 1 in 4, certainly no higher than 1 in 3. And we think as well that there should be caps placed going down to the course level as well. So that way you don't have an issue where students are piled into particular courses. There's some areas of study at the moment, particularly in some of the postgraduate areas, where international student numbers are pushing 60 to 80%, which we think's far too high. And then we think that should also be coupled with integrity measures to ensure that the quality of international students coming in is as high as possible. So tougher English language standards that are enforced better, and some way for staff to alert the regulator through some sort of whistleblower service when there's these, at the moment, anecdotal reports that will be better to be fleshed out about pressure being placed on academics to pass international students who don't meet the standards that we'd expect from our best universities.
Sally, I'll give you the opportunity to make some similar comments.
Thank you, Tim, and good to be here. I'm going to keep my comments fairly brief because both speakers have actually raised quite a number of issues there that I'm sure we'll talk about as we go through, and we'll get into the detail. The 2 points I'd just like to make as an opening statement is, first of all, the group of 8 is absolutely not questioning the need to manage migration and manage growth in international education. Our concern is that if we're going to do this effectively, we really need to understand the reasons. How did we get here in the first place? And make sure that we're addressing any policy interventions or things that we put in place, address the causes of the issues, and not just a short-term, what look like easy fix solutions, but might create other problems down the road. And we've done some analysis. We've pulled some data together through our chief economist. We don't actually think the data supports the position that international students are responsible for the housing crisis. I'm sure we'll pick that up, as I said, in later questions. And the other point to make is just that look, it's in everyone's interest to have a strong quality sector with integrity. The group of 8 does not oppose any measures to improve the quality and the integrity of the sector. If we go to the ESOS Amendment Bill that came out last year, we actually supported the parts of the bill that go to that. What we disagree with, and what I'm sure that we'll debate today, is that international students are necessarily the cause of that. So I'll leave my opening comments there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sally. And yes, we will certainly unpack a lot of these issues as we go through today. But I might just quickly start with you, Simon. You spoke about the ministerial directions and kind of what their purpose is to sort of curb student numbers and alleviate some of the pressures on public service. Could you maybe point to a couple of the key differences, though, how we've sort of moved from its initial 107 to now 111?
Yeah, look, and I think I covered that very briefly in my comments, which is that 107 was really targeted more at, I guess, a recognition that the sector was growing very strongly off the back of COVID and perhaps in a sort of an unanticipated way. And so the initial focus was really how do we make sure as we prioritise that visa processing that we're bringing in those students, if you like, that come through, I guess, the best of all possible integrity pathways into the Australian system. And I think that was sort of the initial focus. But as I said, I think that had a number of problems. I think particularly for some of the more vocationally oriented and regional universities, it meant that they were at a disadvantage, a relative disadvantage to some of the larger, more traditional universities in terms of their student intake. And that created a problem for them. Another problem that was identified through the Senate committee report is that some of the skill sets and courses that were being taught, whilst perfectly valid and reasonable in their own right, weren't also then well matched with some of the skill shortages that Australia has been facing off the back of the pandemic, and that it was actually better to try and have some allowance for that in the nature of bringing students in so that as they were here, they could also, I guess, both be adding to the skill base of Australia as we tackle some of these challenges that we have with supply chains and the like, and which are causing, for example, issues like inflation in the Australian economy. So I think the government listened to those concerns. The initial tool was really, as I said, targeted more around integrity and more established pathways for international students to come in. But I think they have listened to that feedback more generally from the sector, and that's why they've now adopted Ministerial Direction 111, which I said tries to spread the opportunity for higher education institutions a little bit more evenly, make sure that I guess that particularly some of those more vocationally and regionally based universities get a reasonable chance to have some of the international students back, because that does support their wider economic viability in the Australian system. And anyone, I think, who's followed the higher education sector in Australia would know that it's particularly some of those universities that have had more of the financial challenges over the years in terms of their sustainability. So it was designed to try and create a broader and more sustainable future. Now, again, I don't think this is a perfect solution to the problem either. As I said, I still think it's a bit of a blunt instrument that the government's implemented. And I think some of the points that Sally's made, which is right, which is in the longer term, we need to have a more certain and reliable path for growth in the sector, because there's no doubt the higher education sector is a very valuable contributor to the Australian economy, and of course is an international export success story.
Very, very good points, Simon. Yes, I agree with you on the one instrument. We do need to find a way that if we can have something more sustainable and certain. I might pass to you, Nico. In your report that you published late last year, and you mentioned some of the recommendations coming out of that, including the sort of higher English competency standards and recommending caps. And I think probably in particular, that's one area that I know a few people are coming through with Pigeonhole wanting to hear about. What do you think those caps and implementing those recommendations are likely to have an impact on the sector? How do you believe that those caps will improve education?
Well, I think unfortunately a lot of it's anecdotal, but you talk to academics, you talk to students, and I'm a former student as well, obviously. There are clearly instances where the volume and quality of international students is having a detrimental impact on the experience of domestic students. And I agree with what's been said about our universities and international students being an important export. I think that the value of those exports is overstated, which the ABS has made some commentary on, which we can maybe get into later. But I think the crux of it really gets to the fact that it concerns me when too much of the discussion is about our universities being sort of quote unquote global exporters when they're meant to be publicly funded educational institutions. And I think that we've got the balance wrong there. So I think from my perspective, the housing debate, don't get me wrong, is still important. And there's obviously at least some impact on the housing market from the volume of international students that come in. But I think the focus of our universities has shifted too far one way, and the discussion about having caps is about working out what a sustainable level is going forward so that we can still have that export market, we can still have the diversity of students and views coming in, but we can set it at a more sustainable level going forward so that there's certainty for the sector and students.
Fantastic. So picking up on sort of some of the funding issues, Sally, I might throw to you. We know that international students do significantly contribute to funding around R&D activities, as well as some of the teaching and learning in Australian universities. How do you expect some of these potential changes and caps to actually impact on that funding for both R&D and teaching and learning?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And it's a great question that actually doesn't get asked enough. Many people know that universities are obviously educational institutions, and that is clearly a very important part of our mission. Fewer people, I think, understand the value and the importance of the research that we do. So international education is our most successful services export. That's been said already today. It's worth more than 50 billion annually. It's been the main driver of economic growth post-COVID, but also was an important part pre-COVID. In fact, some figures by the NAB said that in 2023, spending by international students contributed 0.8 percentage points to GDP, which was over half the economic growth for that year, I believe. So that's not a figure to be taken lightly, but not only do international students make a direct contribution to our economy, to our skills and our talent pool, we also greatly benefit from the people-to-people links. There's a whole lot of non-economic things that are incredibly important as well that underpin our diplomacy efforts in a very rapidly evolving and increasingly complex environment. And I would argue that our international relations is probably more important to the success of Australia right now than it's been for a very long time, although it's always been significant. Now, one of our international education is key to Australia's soft diplomacy efforts around the world, particularly in our region. Australian unis have been educating students from the Asian region for decades, and we've developed very close links, research and education ties. This engagement has broad implications for Australian business and industry and our economic growth. And one of our concerns about this debate is that it's sending entirely the wrong signal to the international community. We should learn the lessons from Canada, which imposed a hard cap on student numbers at the start of 2024, and Canada has now dropped from first to fourth in the world as a preferred study destination. Enrolments have dropped by 20%. You can't overstate the economic importance of international education, and this was really clear during the CAPS debate, where we saw many organisations come out against it. The BCA, ACCI, state government, expert economists. So that's the education side. To turn to the research side, research is an incredibly significant thing. As we sit here in 2025, we now have a world that's dominated by AI, by autonomy, by cyber, by COVID vaccines. We saw how quickly that happened. These are things that I would challenge anyone to come up with a picture of what a successful, prosperous, engaged 2025 economy or even society looks like if you take research out of the picture. So I think sometimes we have this idea that research is a nice to have. It's something that you do when you've dealt with everything else. I think we're well and truly out of that world now. We're into a world where it's part and parcel of what we do. Now, if you have a look at the funding, the Group of Eight do around 70% of Australia's university-based research, and we calculate that that's about 20% of the national research effort. So it's really quite significant. We spend collectively about 8.5 billion per year on research, and from the federal government, we get about 2.3 billion. So there's an obvious funding gap there. If we also look at students, domestic students, and I think, Nico, you raised this a little earlier, educating domestic students is really important, but there's a funding shortfall with that as well. So if we look at veterinary students, medical students, I believe the figure, I may need to be corrected on this, but I think it's about a $10,000 shortfall per student per year that universities have to make up from somewhere. International students bring in tuition money. That's one of the very few sources of funding we can use to actually plug those gaps. So they're contributing to our research effort. They're contributing to the quality education of our domestic students. They're also creating an environment where I don't think anymore you can, I don't think it's a great educational experience to just sit in a monocultural classroom. I think it's incredibly important now. Students are graduating, they're going out, they're filling jobs across the region, they're working in teams and in companies in Australia that are multicultural. So having that experience of actually being able to engage with different cultures is also incredibly important, and work effectively in teams with people. So very quick walk through a broader scope of what universities do, but I might leave my comments there for the moment.
Thank you, Sally. I mean, I think picking up on those research activities, there's been some sort of questions around, are we going to be losing a lot of the richness of the research that comes out? And I know that we've got some questions here that we sort of punch above our weight. Simon, maybe bring you into the debate. Do you see another way to supplement some of these funding kind of revenues, streams rather? And is this kind of importance of things like medical research being lost in this debate and in this story?
Yeah, well, I think Sally actually made some really important points. I mean, like, one of the reasons why we kind of have a bit of this debate and the odd sort of moral panic about the university sector here in Australia is that first and most fundamental point is that, are we properly funding the university sector to provide education to Australians who want to go to university? I think that's the first point. And, the previous and current Labor government have certainly been working on those sorts of measures in terms of providing the ability for universities to be able to find and fund places for more Australian students. I think also, we can't ignore the impact of things like HECS debt and the consequences that it's having on a lot of younger Australians and the choices that they're making around choice. And it's not just about a university education. This applies across the vet sector as well. We need to be skilling up Australians regardless of the particular skill set they might want to train in, because we need a more skilled workforce by one means or another. And of course, migration, whether it's through the higher education sector or more generally, can be an augment to that. But our first and primary obligation has got to be to train Australians first for the jobs and opportunities that exist in Australia. And that means we need to spend more money on education and training, right from early education right through the university sector. So I think that's sort of point number one. The next is around universities and R&D, and I think Sally again made a very good point, which is that, look, our universities are a very important part of that R&D ecosystem, and the international education sector is a part of that. But Ed Husey gave a very important speech yesterday at the National Press Club where he talked about more generally the lack of investment that particularly comes from parts of the business community into research and development here in Australia. It's not something that we are across the board good at. We do it very well for very certain sectors, but we're not as broadly based as we could be. And one of the issues that Australia has more generally as economy is that we tend to be too narrowly focused on a small number of sectors, rather than seeing ourselves as a broadly based and complex economy, which is where we will actually make more money, be wealthier, create more jobs and economic wealth for Australians going forward. So these are part of a wider set of ecospheres, if you like, and the international education sector is a small part of a much bigger set of problems. But public investment in Australians is the foundation of all of that.
Great. Thank you, Simon. I'm also just thinking back to a comment that, Nico, you made a moment ago around the sort of diversity and the sort of culture that are coming in with the students, for international students. So there is a question here around, wouldn't that diversity and experience of culture only serve to increase the experience and quality of the education offering rather than to dilute it in some cases?
Well, I mean, certainly in some cases, no one's arguing against, no one's arguing for a monocultural classroom. As Sally said before, or disputing the value of people-to-people links and having international students. Our view is just that doesn't require the level of international students, which is now more than 50% of students at some of the Group of 8 universities. And it's even Peter Varghese, the Chancellor of UQ, one of the Group of 8 members, has effectively admitted the need for caps, saying that if they're not in place, it'll keep going in excess of 50%. So our view is certainly not saying international students are bad or they shouldn't be there. It's just that the balance has tipped too far the one way, and that is now becoming to the detriment of Australian students who should be the focus of Australian universities, particularly publicly funded universities. That's it. But the points, just to address some of Sally's points on research and funding domestic students, those are completely fair points, and that's a discussion that needs to be had. As Simon said, part of the problem in Australia is actually that our business community doesn't invest in R&D enough, and our R&D is very heavily weighted towards higher ed. But at the moment, I think that we're kind of missing that discussion because it's become very binary in that, yes, university research and development is funded by international students, and everyone's kind of accepting that that's the way things have to be. And if you cut international students, you can't have research, and there's no other way to fund it. But, as Simon addressed at the very start, both sides of politics are of the view that international students need to be capped. It's almost certainly going to happen after the election, one way or another. So if that's going to affect our research funding, and a discussion needs to be had about what should research in this country look like? What should our universities be focusing on? How does the business community pull its weights better? How do we better connect our universities to the business community, which happens in most other OECD countries? The US, the UK, some European countries, like the Germans, are much better at building those links between universities and the business sector. But at the moment, that entire discussion isn't really happening here, and we're stuck in this binary debate between saying, well, we use international students to fund the shortfall, so that's the way things have to be going forward. And we think that we need to tip that balance back the other way, and then we'll have the discussions that we need to have about what implications that has for funding.
Right. While I've got you in the context of the broader economy, do you kind of have a sense of the sort of impact that introducing these sorts of caps might actually have in a sort of broader economic sense?
Well, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. I haven't actually done them, but there's no doubt that reducing the value of international students, will have an impact on GDP. But I don't think that's the be all and end all of this, because obviously if you take that to the nth degree, more people obviously brings in higher GDP, but there are costs to that as well. If you take that argument to an extreme, you should have 100% international students because they all bring in more money. So there has to be some sustainable level. The benefits of international students do largely accrue to the to the educations that receive the fees from them, and the costs are borne by the wider community in terms of the services that need to be provided for those people, and the housing costs. And I do think there's a bit of a debate that needs to be had on the way that we do count those services exports. We're a bit down in the weeds here, but essentially the way the ABS does calculate those service exports is that for the full length of time that an international student is in Australia, whether that be 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years, they're effectively counted as though they're living overseas, and all the money they're spending in Australia is an export, even if they earn it in Australia from an Australian employer. And the ABS put out, I thought, a very interesting piece a few months ago on this, stating that of the $50 billion in so-called exports that we have from international students, as much as 15 billion of it roughly may be income that was earned in Australia and really shouldn't be counted as an export. So I do think that's something that policymakers need to take into account when they're talking about the economic impact of these things, in that it's arguably, I think, a bit overstated, the impact of international students and the potential impact of caps.
Thank you. It is obviously a challenge balancing all these things, and it is a challenging debate. I'm going through one of the questions here in Pigeonhole, and we've got AI Group has linked migration, education, housing, employment, but they seem to be more concerned with non-uni skilled workers like electricians. Sally, maybe your perspectives on, should we be focusing broader beyond just universities to sort of entire tertiary education, and should we be doing that as a holistic view of some of these challenges?
It's actually a really, really good question. I have to say up front, my experience and my knowledge is the university sector. I don't know about the other sectors in as much detail, so I'll leave someone else to speak on them in terms of statistics. But I think the importance is, and it is actually a really good point, because quite often in the discourse, the words international education and universities tend to be used interchangeably. And of course, although universities are a very important part of that sector, they are actually only part of that sector. So along with universities, there's a group of providers that are non-university higher education providers. We call them new HEPs, which I think was coined by Andrew Norton. It's a catchy phrase. But then, of course, you also have vocational education and training students. You have school students come over. We have English language students. So it is definitely a much broader picture than I think the debate or the discourse often picks up. Now, from the Group of Eight's perspective, we see ourselves, and I know it's difficult when you're talking about things in isolation because we tend to talk about the higher ed sector or the business sector or the government sector, where, of course, in reality, a healthy economy, a healthy society, all of those things are interfeeding into each other all of the time. So if you're just looking at it in isolation, you can sometimes miss some of the broader effects of these things. From our perspective, of course, we want a strong international education sector. We want a quality international education sector. We want a sector that's underpinned by integrity. As I said at the beginning, that everyone benefits from that, whether it's a school student or a university student or a domestic student, because I think one of the things that gets missed is any additional funding that universities have above and beyond what they go into their core business goes back into the community. So I already talked about how international student fees subsidise research. That research goes out into the business community. It helps progress society. I've talked about how it supplements the training of domestic vets and health staff, doctors. And we all know that we have a shortfall of doctors, and we're all concerned about that. It funds scholarships for disadvantaged students. So the integration of these things is actually really important. And a strong vet sector is just as important as a strong higher education sector, because a healthy society needs all kinds of different skills. As our chief executive often says, you don't have to go to university to benefit from a university. So every time you cross a bridge, that's an engineer. Every time you get into a plane, that's a pilot. Every time you go and see the doctor, that's someone who's been to university. So yeah, a healthy society is very multifactorial. And I think it's a great question because I think we do sometimes lose track of that.
I might take a little bit of a diversion in tack here, and we've got a question coming through, Simon. I think maybe be interested to hear with all of this debate and this rhetoric, do you feel that it might be feeding into discrimination within Australia and within the international student community?
Look, I think there's always a risk anytime you have a debate about sort of migration in any sector, that it can have that sort of effect. I think the key is for those people involved as much as possible to be responsible in the way they talk about it, and obviously to continue to manage our migration program on a non-discriminatory basis. And I think if you look at our international student basis, I mean, the reality is the vast majority of our students are coming from either China or India. So we have enormous populations coming from those parts of the world. We have very strong population growth amongst both of those communities here amongst the Australian diaspora. So I actually think there's enormous potential to actually build social cohesion and opportunity through an effective migration and international education sector. And as Sally quite rightly said, like, we shouldn't just see this as a binary thing that happens, over a 2 or 3 year period while a student might be in Australia. We're creating effectively a diaspora of people who have got a connection and love for Australia because of the period that they spent here as students. I mean, I know lots of people who have come here as students, gone back to the country that they've come from, and are still looking for, even though they've got no desire necessarily to move back to Australia, still have strong cultural, business and other ties to Australia as a culture, as part of that. And I think that's one of the great successes of Australia more generally as a multicultural society. So is there a risk there? Yes, there absolutely is. We always need to make sure that when we have debates about migration, that we do so in a non-discriminatory fashion. And it's unfortunate, I think, that some people do tend to sort of brand certain communities as being responsible for these types of problems. I think that's completely irresponsible to do so. The truth is the vast majority of international students who come here have a great time in Australia, get a great education, and if they go back home afterwards, love this country and want to keep associated with it.
Absolutely, and very worth keeping that in mind. And I think on a similar sort of vein, is there capacity, or do you feel like the government may be considering a more nuanced immigration policy to potentially refocus it on looking at those critical skill shortages, and the sort of care economy and those sorts of things, is there capacity to sort of shift that debate a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, the government already has done that, if you like, at looking at like the critical skills list for migration into Australia. And, whilst, for example, the international student population shouldn't be the primary source of filling, Australian-based skills shortages. As I said, actually, the first thing to do is to make sure that Australians have the opportunities to get the training to fill those jobs if they wish to. But Australia is always going to be a net importer of both capital and labour. It's part of our great economic success and the migrant success we've built since the Second World War. I think it'd be a great shame if Australia lost that. And I said the international education sector is a small but important part of that narrative. So I think Australia's got an enormous potential, but we do need to manage very carefully and sensitively as we go along those pressures as they build up. And like housing is a classic one. At the moment, there is no doubt that there is, Australians genuinely are experiencing a housing crisis. We're just simply not building enough. And part of that is obviously regulation, mainly at the state and local government level, where we need to, get out of the way and help, greater development to occur. But also governments have got to invest in that. And the federal government's got a package effectively around about $32 billion of investment into the housing sector to try and stimulate and create those opportunities. And even in the international education space, one of the factors which the government is taking into account in setting the caps is the ability of universities to go out and build more student accommodation so that you're taking less pressure, putting less pressure on the wider housing market, creating more housing that international students may actually want to live in the first place. So I think there are a range of policy levers that can be explored, and I know state governments are very active in that space too. I particularly know a lot that the New South Wales government is doing to try and support its higher education sector by getting more of these student accommodation developments off the ground.
Absolutely. And you mentioned in there, making sure that we have opportunities for Australians for some of those critical skills shortages and enabling our sort of domestic pipeline. I think in that context, Nico, you've mentioned that some universities have more than 50% of international students. Is there a question here about, trying to then really, really develop much more of the domestic kind of pipeline for pathways from school, for example, to be trying to put more of our domestic population through the universities?
Well, actually, I think actually Sally hit it on the head before. It's actually not just about going to universities. It's about, outside of universities, it's about vocational education. There's 60% of Australians don't go to university, and I don't think, we should be saying that there's any problem with that at all. Filling those skill shortages often involves people from outside of universities, and particularly, from the international student side. Generally speaking, when you're filling skill shortages, it's actually not international students that are the first port of call for that. It's people with 3 to 5 years work experience overseas that are already in their profession. So I think that actually the answer is, better pathways for people into trades and vocational education. I genuinely don't think there's a need to be pushing people into universities more than they already are, because those opportunities are there. Australia's got one of the most open university systems with the HEC system in the world. If you want to go to university, it's pretty easy to do so, as long as you can meet the requirements.
Yes, well, and as you say, we have seen huge amount of growth in the sector, and there is the diversity of offerings for tertiary education that we need to also be considering, and very valid points by yourself and Sally on that front as well. I would be interested to get a bit of a sense of how we think some of these policy changes following the election might actually really kind of weigh into the sorts of forward planning for some of the institutions, whether it be universities or in the vet sector. But maybe focusing on the university sector, Sally, how is this likely to sort of factor into the forward sort of business planning for these universities?
Tim, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? One of the issues that we had last year was just that there was an awful lot of policy change in a relatively short space of time. And when you're a domestic person trying to keep up with that, it's hard enough. When you're an international student or a prospective international student trying to follow what's happening in the policy space in Australia, it is quite difficult. And that's actually been one of our concerns from the beginning, is just, and I do want to say up front, look, we are absolutely, at the Group of Eight, up for the conversation about if our funding model is broken, and look, we've been saying that since at least 2015, I think, let's have a conversation about if we do think as a society, and I think it's a conversation we need to have as a society, do we have too many international students? Let's have that conversation, but let's make sure that we do it when we're in a context where we understand all of the implications, we understand that it's not a quick fix for things like the housing crisis, so that's actually a multifactorial problem that's developed over years. I think Simon spoke about that a little earlier. And let's actually get some solutions that are going to help society, give us strong, healthy universities, make sure that we've got strong graduates, international and domestic, and that we're equipped for work in the 2025. So we are absolutely up for that conversation. And we're certainly not questioning the need to manage migration and manage growth in international education. So our end game here is around, let's get an effective funding model that works for universities and works for society. Let's have healthy education institutions, whether that's universities, vet, schools, whatever it is. Let's foster a strong and cohesive society and make sure that we have all of the services and the skills and the graduates and the research and all of those things that we actually need to prosper in what is becoming actually quite a complicated world.
Yes, that's a very, very good point. And the one thing that I'm hearing a lot of is the sort of uncertainty, and
Yeah.
you know, that sort of element of complication, and it certainly is challenging. So one of the questions that does sort of probably remain is, you know, do you think that these policies could potentially be pushing, or these uncertainties rather, could be pushing students into alternative study destinations?
Absolutely one of the possibilities, yeah. We have to be aware that the way that the education systems, we tend to talk about it very transactionally in Australia. We often go to the economic argument first, and of course I'm sitting here at CEDA, so that's obviously the focus of most people on this call. But many cultures see education in a very different way. They see it as a very altruistic thing. It's part of building a prosperous civil society. And we have to be careful with those narratives because they don't necessarily play well overseas. If we go and we talk about how much money international students bring into our country, then some countries will see that as we're very transactional in how we approach it. Then you've got the issue of, as I said before, rapid policy change over a short period of time. You can very easily, inadvertently, create the impression that we actually don't want international students anymore. And they miss the nuance of what we're really talking about, or what we really need to be talking about is effective management of migration, not closing the doors to the rest of the world. And I know I keep sort of bringing it back to the bigger picture, but I think that's always been important, our international relations. But at this particular point in time, I think how we are seen internationally and how we engage internationally is quite fundamental to our success at the moment in what is a very contested time. So we've always been, and we've been saying this for some time, one of our key concerns is actually the potential for reputational damage, not just for us as a education destination, but for us as a country and how we're seen in our region. And I know that a lot of work has been done by pretty much both governments over time to position Australia as a strong, effective, and very important regional partner, noting that we are one of many different countries in this region. And our concern is that blunt instrument policies that happen very quickly can undo a lot of that work very quickly. So it can take a long time to build a reputation. It can take a very short time to destroy a reputation. And that is absolutely one of the things we're very concerned about.
Absolutely, and thinking through those policies in terms of how can we maybe approach some of these things differently, and what are some of the alternatives that we might be able to employ. Going back to a comment you made, Simon, around the purpose-built accommodation, and we've got a question that is coming through that's the price is often beyond sort of, within the means of a lot of domestic students. Should we be looking at sort of, reforms maybe in not-for-profit sort of sector to help support some of the purpose-built university accommodation and keep some of those costs down?
Yep. Well, obviously, a lot of people remember, in fact, the Rudd government had the national housing policies that actually did help a number of the universities. I'm sitting here in Canberra, and the ANU was a big user of those schemes to build more dedicated student accommodation, and not just for international students. I mean, I think anyone who has come to the ANU over the last sort of 15 or 20 years know that it was always difficult to find student accommodation, no matter where you came from around the world or across the country, to house at the ANU in particular, and the University of Canberra, to its credit as well, put a lot of effort into making sure that students actually had a place to come to and had a place to live, so that they could study. And I think universities have done that. Some universities, I think, have done that well, and I think we can look to those sort of exemplar models. But if you look at, for example, the current government's funding of social and affordable housing, well, funding for university students can very much fit into those models for Australian students as well. It's not only important, obviously, in terms of being able to make sure that students are relatively proximate to the places where they're studying. It's ultimately important more generally that, particularly when you've got people where they're doing kind of a vocational qualifications off the back of their study. So nurses, for example, will then need to go and work in a major hospital as part of their sort of transition into their careers, and they do that through their study as well, of course. Well, they need to be able to afford to live near the places they work, and if we don't have a society that's structured on that basis, then in fact we don't get the basic service delivery that we want right across the country. So these things are very important. I think in a lot of regional communities, they're desperate to actually have more students to go out and study in parts of regional Australia, because they know if they actually attract them and they get to see what the joys of the lifestyle of living out in regional Australia is, more of them are likely to stay and want to live and work in those communities. So housing is a really critical part, not because it's just a roof over people's heads, but it actually integrates people into the wider community that ultimately they're there to be part of and there to service through their occupation as they go through life. So as I said, the government's got considerable measures in place through Housing Australia to fund social and affordable housing, and students absolutely can be beneficiaries of that.
Wonderful. We still have a lot of questions to go through, but I am mindful of time. And what I would like to do is to just invite the three panelists to maybe give a quick wrap up. If there's one thing that you want to leave us with today, what would that point be? Sally, maybe I start with you.
No problem. I think the key things to understand is that there's a bigger picture than just international students here. And when we talk about international students, there's a bigger picture than just international students and migration. So international students are actually a really important part of our society. They perform an incredibly important role in many, many different ways. They're important obviously for the money that they bring in, that subsidises important Australian functions, but they also contribute to our society. They fill important skills gaps. They help to train domestic students to be effective in a multicultural world. And those that leave, and the majority of them do, 84%, we think, once they've come over here, completed their studies, actually do leave the country. They go out there as ambassadors for Australia, and that's incredibly important. So from our perspective, as I said before, the Group of 8 is up for a more nuanced conversation. We absolutely agree with the need to manage migration and manage growth in international education. But in having that conversation, let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here, where what we don't want to do is have quick fix solutions that don't address the real causes of what's going on and that can cause inadvertent damage to the rest of our sector or to other parts of our economy.
Nico, how anything to respond or to add or to focus?
I'm heartened to hear that the Group of 8's up to have the discussion. I think in the last year or so that discussion's been lacking on all sides, as we kind of just debated the general point back and forth. And I think, after the election, one way or another, there will most likely be a settled policy on this, rather than, as Simon said, it's been a bit of a blunt instrument. I understand why the government's had to do that, but we can hopefully move on from that. And, I'd really like to see a future where our major universities, particularly the Group of Eight, see themselves first and foremost as premier domestic educational institutions, not as an export industry, and not as, a big billion-dollar business, because I think education should come first, second, and third. And then when they're looking at the international student market, they're looking at, how do we get the best, most high-quality students into our country, rather than those who are going to pay the highest fees to subsidise domestic students and research. Because I think I understand why universities have that incentive at the moment, and I think, it'd be great if we could flip that around and get back to the core business of what I think universities are supposed to be.
Simon.
Maybe I'll just make one observation, which is, I think, regardless of the result of the election, as people can see, we're certainly heading into a period of maybe a bit of pause and reflection for the sector about how to tackle some of these challenges. And I think, as we've all agreed, it's not just a simple debate about the number of students coming in and exactly where they go. This is a wider debate around all the policy levers that need to work to make sure that the sector's got the broader social licence from the Australian people to continue to be successful and to continue to make a great success and profit for the Australian people as a whole. I think the reality is we're talking more at this stage anyway about a pause on growth in the sector rather than a freeze or a retreat from the sector. And I think that's really important. I'd hate to see us go backwards in this sector. And I understand Sally's points around potential reputational risk and how that could adversely affect us. But I think the sector is going to need to turn up, and be ready in a couple of months' time with whomever forms government, by the middle of the year. It's going to need to have a plan that's more than just about saying, let's change these little arrangements that are in place now. It's about how we're going to set ourselves a mid to longer term path for sustainable growth in the sector that looks after Australian students first, as Nico said, make sure that we're still providing international students with a fantastic education, and then more broadly meeting the skill challenges of Australia.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to say a really, really big thank you to the three of you. This has been a fantastic conversation. One of the things that certainly came through to me is that there are a lot of points of commonality, and I think there's also a lot of will to have a sensible, considered debate and discussion around how we might have more of those, as you say, nuanced conversations, how we might actually find a path through that sort of satisfies the broader context, as you say, Simon. So I really do want to say thank you for all of your time. I've certainly got a lot out of this. I'd also just like to quickly say thanks again to NAB as the sponsor, and just to let everybody know that if you will be getting an email post-event with recording, but we'll also have it available on the CEDA website for those members, and you can also stay in touch via that website for any of our upcoming events. We've got highly relevant to a lot of this conversation, tackling the housing crisis with Minister Claire O'Neill on February the 18th, which is a live stream. And we've got our sort of Progress 2050 launch for CEDA, which is on the 5th of March. So all sorts of other events there that you can obviously get involved in and have a think about and be part of the debate. But I will leave it there and say, again, a huge thank you to our three panelists, and thank you so much for joining us today, everyone online.